I would like to introduce our guest this evening, the author, that is Marcus Lowth, who's waiting here in the green room beside us. So I have been presented with a bio of him, and I've got a summary of that right here. So Marcus Lowth is an acclaimed writer. He's a researcher and expert in the field of the paranormal and anomalous phenomena. He's just like us. And he has 20 years plus experience in the study of ufology, aliens, unsolved mysteries, cryptozoology, conspiracy theories, as well as legends, folklore, and more. So he is going to be touching the bases of everything that we are interested in. And since 2015, he has authored hundreds of articles for leading platforms such as UFO Insight, where he serves as the editor-in-chief, Mysterious Universe, Listverse, and Me Time for the Mind. He's the author of the book From Deep Within the Archives of UFO Insight, History's Most Bizarre, Outlandish and Controversial, and Alien Encounters, which sits over there. Marcus is also the co-host of the podcast, The Anomaly Project, where he explores intriguing connections between disparate phenomena, UFOs, poltergeist, cryptids, spontaneous human combustion, reincarnation, consciousness, and questioning whether there is a deeper, unified reality. I'm in that camp myself. I do think the crossover is tangible, and it's worth exploring. So as such, I've asked a couple of people who have this in mind as well to come and join us in a conversation tonight. So I would ask Marcus to come step up from the green room onto the stage and come and share your presentation, my good friend.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Just bear with me one moment and get that sorted. There we go.
But before we get into that, you like members of ASSAP and like myself, this topic has been touching you for a long time. Where did that inspiration for? I'm aware ancient alien theory tickles you a lot. Where did that start? Did it start in the same place as it was for me?
Well, to be honest, I've always been interested in anything anomalous. It kind of really started with an interest in UFOs. That's what kind of really dragged me in, And the more you start researching stuff like that, the ancient alien theory, certainly like it does everybody at one stage or another, it captivated me for a while. But the more I started researching UFOs, the more I found myself looking at other fields of interest that I wouldn't say I didn't have an interest in them, but I certainly wasn't looking to research them. So whether it was like straying into territory to do with ghosts or poltergeists, ancient mysteries, ancient civilizations, the more you research ancient astronaut theory, the more you are really researching ancient civilizations and antediluvian civilizations and things of that nature. What really solidified it, though, and I use the word crossover, and obviously I'll explain this as we go through the talk, is the more I started researching things, the more I was looking back at things that had happened in my life previously, like when I was a child, a teenager, young adult, and starting to think, that maybe was a little bit stranger than I thought. And the more I started looking at these things and finding connections between different aspects of the paranormal world, the more I started seeing how the strange experiences that I had were kind of fitting into all of this. And that's really what kind of crossed me over from an enthusiast, I suppose, to an active researcher. And at this stage, I am just a researcher, but the more, as I mentioned, the research is in flux, as it always is. But, you follow where the evidence leads you. And so who knows where I'm going to be in a year, what I'm going to be researching and why. But, I just found that everything seems to be connected, and everything seems to be connected. Stuff that we don't even view as paranormal. So, it just really fascinates me. I think it tells us more about human reality than the paranormal, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, I certainly concur with that. So I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to enjoy your bunker here of the Crossover Project. That room that you've got set up there is like my ideal office space. So that's brilliant. So I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to let you talk, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Christian. Thank you, Caroline. Okay, hello, I'm Marcus Lowth, and welcome to The Crossover, which is a talk about how seemingly unrelated aspects of the paranormal and anomalous world are very much connected. Now, The Crossover is basically the title of a book that I'm working on right now, and hopefully that'll be available the late summer this year. But as I've just said there, much of the research for this is very much in flux. It's a combination of research into wider paranormal phenomena and encounters, combined with my own personal experiences and how they might fit in, to the wider anomalous world. Now, given the size of the topic, we're going to really skim the surface, and we'll be leaping around from subject to subject. So please do bear with me. And with all this in mind, what is to follow is partly anecdotal, partly speculative, and I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. But asking questions ultimately is what leads us to the answers and revelations that I think we all seek. Now, I'm not the first person by any stretch of the imagination to suggest that different aspects of the paranormal world are connected. I mean, Ballet and Keel, as you can see here, they were speaking about this decades ago. And one thing they also mentioned, as well as, putting forward that these seemingly unconnected fields of interest were very much connected, they also both spoke about a trickster element to all of this. And this is something that's going to come up as we go, because that could prove to be of importance too. Now, at this stage in my research, I seem to find that there are two main different viewpoints on what the connections are. The first of these suggests that basically, at its most basic level, all paranormal phenomena is the result of an overriding intelligence that wears different masks. Essentially, it's coming from the same source, and it manifests itself in different ways, whether that be as an alien, as a Bigfoot, as a cryptid creature, even as poltergeist phenomena. And it does this for various reasons, but the main reason being that it does this to gain trust with the person it's interacting with. Now, the second main viewpoint or theory as to what these connections are is, rather than being an overriding intelligence, it's actually a mechanism that allows different phenomena access to our realm. Essentially, this mechanism opens, say, portals, and the word, I don't really like that word because it's frowned upon, but temporary gateways, shall we say, that allows these different phenomena, be it UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, cryptids, access to our realm of existence. Now, I sit somewhere in between the two of these. I do believe that there is an overriding intelligence that does manifest itself in different ways, and it does so to basically trick the person it's interacting with. It's that trickster element. But I believe that this overriding intelligence exists within the same mechanism that all these other paranormal entities, creatures, objects also exist within. And so this mechanism allows all of these entities and objects access to our world. Now, it's important here to stress that when I say our world, I'm not speaking about our world how most people would understand it. I'm speaking about our realm of existence, our dimension, our physical plane, and essentially vibration of consciousness. Now, the reason that I think that we are talking about we're not talking about an overriding intelligence explaining all paranormal phenomena is there are simply too many variables for one overriding intelligence. For example, if you are speaking or interacting with your long dead Auntie Mary, for example, now you could well be interacting with an unknown intelligence with a nefarious agenda in mind. But by the same token, you could well be interacting with the energy or essence or soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, of your Auntie Mary. And I think a lot of this has to do with personal consciousness, subconsciousness, and how you perceive the world around you. Now, here I think it's appropriate to just mention a personal encounter that I experienced a few years ago, because I think it's a good example of how personal perception and consciousness plays a big part in this. Now, my wife and her mother, they had a long-standing agreement, basically, that, as tragic as it is, when one of them passed away, they would come back, try to come back and let them know that they were there. They had agreed on the night of the funeral, the other person would basically just simply light a candle, and the person who had passed away would blow this out as a sign that they were there. Now, my wife's mother did pass away tragically, 2018, in December 2018. And when we had the funeral, remembering what they'd agreed, my wife did light a candle, and we, stayed in the room for several hours. Now nothing happened. It wasn't extinguished. We had to extinguish it ourselves, and then we went up to bed. Now, the next morning, and I get up early most mornings, so we're talking about 5:30, 6 a.m., something like that. I got up as I would do, I made a coffee, and I lit the candle for really nothing more than atmosphere. I wasn't really thinking about, let's see if anything happens. And I was reading a book, and as I invariably do, I dozed off, while I was reading. And it's those kind of sleeps where you kind of, in between being asleep and awake, and I think this is important, you could hear the birds outside, I could hear the odd car going past, but I wasn't awake. I was dozing, And then out of nowhere, in my ear, about here, I was in the living room, I heard a boo in my ear, and it was so close, I could hear the sound and somebody's breath right there. Now, what's interesting is my mother-in-law, Diane, this is exactly the kind of thing she would do. If she saw you in a supermarket, for example, and you hadn't seen her, she'd creep up behind her and boo, and just as a little jokey way. So immediately I just thought, that's Diane. And I just kind of know this in my being. And I know that science, they won't accept that you just know. And I accept that. I can't prove that. But I kind of just know that was Diane. And on top of this, the candle was no longer lit. Now, that could have been coincidence as well. I accept that. But as I say, the reason I think that she kind of, revealed herself to me as opposed to Tracy, who's a daughter, is I think there's several reasons. I think at the time I was just more open to that. I was just more open to the possibility of that happening. And if we accept that ghosts require energy, it takes a lot of energy for them to communicate, whether it's to actually, manifest themselves, whether it's just to say a word. And so possibly expending that energy, it was targeted at me because I would probably have been more receptive to it. I also think the time that it happened, it was around about 6 a.m. just after. Now, we know, although statistics are hard to actually come by, but a lot of paranormal activity happens between midnight and 6 a.m. with a real kind of concentration at peak, if you like, between 3 and 4. The reasons for this, who knows, but it could there's simply more energy found being used that these spirits can draw upon. And I think the other key element of this particular encounter was the fact that I was coming out of sleep. I was in that in-between stage of not being asleep and not really being awake. So I think for all those reasons, that's why I think I experienced that as opposed to my wife. And I think it's a good example how consciousness and personal perception plays a real role, in how we perceive and experience paranormal phenomena. Now, I'm going to come back to my own personal encounters pretty much in the second half of this. And first, what I'm going to do is speak about what exactly do I mean when I say everything's connected. What are we talking about? What details specifically? Now, I think we're all aware of areas of high strangeness. Skinwalker Ranch is on Rocky Mountain Ranch, both of which are on the west side of the United States. And we've also got the Meadow, which is somewhere in the southern states of America, though its exact location has been kept purposely secret by those investigating it. Now, these locations, they're awash with paranormal encounters, whether it's UFOs, Bigfoot, the notion that there's portals that exist there, even strange disappearances. But the fact is, as much as these three locations are perhaps the most well known, these locations of high strangeness are all around the planet. Now, if we just look at UFO hotspots, for example, many UFO hotspots are also areas where you get an abundance of reports of Bigfoot sightings. There are also areas, as I say, where people claim that portals exist. And more specifically as well, for the areas such as Hudson Valley in New York and San Luis Valley in Colorado, which we can see here, many people disappear in these regions. Mysteriously disappear as well. So, these locations are everywhere, and it seems that there's a concentration. They're almost like a hub of strange phenomena. Now, here in the United Kingdom, we've stretching from right the way through Yorkshire to the northwest of England, northeast of England, and all the way up to Scotland. We have an area of the UK which is loosely referred to and known as Alien Alley. And now, as the name suggests, we get an abundance of UFO sightings in there, alien encounters also, alien abduction, but also there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings in this Alien Alley, particularly in the northwest, and even sightings of dogmen, which is bizarre to most, but they are on record. So we might ask them, why are certain areas seemingly teeming with paranormal activity? Now, we have to think it's something in the land, essentially. It's something either in the bedrock or in the atmosphere, or it's a combination of all of these things. Essentially, a lot of these areas of high strangeness reside in locations of high electromagnetic energy. So we have to ask, is this electromagnetic energy, is it creating portals or gateways? And, does it require specific phenomena to come together to do so? Or could it be that this electromagnetic energy is actually reacting with ourselves, with the electrical signals within the brain, essentially reacting with our consciousness? Now, again, this sounds quite outlandish to some people that you can go to a location and your emotions can be affected. But there are several locations on record which people have studied, and they have noticed a direct influence with human emotion. Now, perhaps one of the strangest of these is and I hope I pronounce this correctly, the Aokigahara Forest in Japan. It's sometimes referred to as a suicide forest, and as the name suggests, many people travel there, unfortunately, tragically, with the intention of taking their own lives, and many do. Now, some people will tell you that, the people that do venture there, they are of a negative mindset anyway, that they're feeling, despair. And so, they're already intent on doing the worst, essentially, by going there. But others suggest that the energy within this forest or within the ground there could, if not influence a person's emotions, it could at least enhance that. So if you go in there feeling despair and feeling despondent, then you're going to feel even worse. Now, that could be easily brushed aside, but when experiments and studies were done of the suicide forest in Japan, they found that there were magnetic anomalies that corresponded directly with human emotion and affecting human emotion. Essentially, that they would almost evoke feelings of despair, of despondency, and things of that nature, and ultimately result of people to be taking their lives. If we look at the Golden Gate Bridge, on the west coast of the United States in San Francisco, this is another suicide hotspot. Now, this could simply be, morbid convenience. But when you look at the magnetic readings around that area, they're very similar to those in the suicide forest. So again, we might have a location here where the electromagnetic energies that are basically interacting with human energies and human emotions and human consciousness. Now, while we're speaking of locations that are affecting human emotions, we could do worse to look at Ben Macdui in Scotland. Now, this is another location of high strangeness. Now, one is not, there are no accounts of people taking their own lives. Many people who have ventured up there do speak of, sudden feelings of fear, of despair, of depression, and seemingly overtaking them to the point where they have to leave. They feel like they have to leave immediately. Many people have written about this in books, famous psychics and mystics. And, it really would feel, some people have said that until they can get away from the entire region, they sense these feelings having a grip on them. Other people have reported hearing people following them, and they've said that these footsteps are like giant long strides. And whenever they turn around, though, there's nobody there, although the descriptions that they give would be indicative of some kind of Bigfoot creature. And there have been people who have camped on there in the early 2000s. There was a chap who went camping on there for no other reason than just to see what he could find. And he reported seeing a Bigfoot creature that was well over 10 feet tall. From his tent, you could see it walking away in the distance. Most interestingly of all, though, are people that have gone up to Ben Macdui and they found themselves having conversations with unknown entities, almost unknown energies. And when that conversation is finished, and they've gone on for quite some time, they have no idea what they were talking about, what the conversation was about at all. So again, we've got another location there where there seems to be some kind of direct influence over human emotion and human consciousness. Now, this is interesting because if you look at paranormal case files, whether they're alien abduction accounts, whether they're poltergeist hauntings, any paranormal case study, you will often find that many people will say they have feelings of uncontrollable and absolute terror that they just cannot control, and they come out of nowhere. But on the other side of that, some people also speak of, particularly with alleged encounters with aliens, they speak of euphoric encounters of pure joy and happiness and essentially being at peace. Whatever the emotion, though, there seems to be ample evidence that paranormal activities and locations of high strangeness have some kind of direct effect on human emotion, and so in turn on the electrical signals of the mind and the brain. And these could be more long-lasting than many people think. And this is something that we'll come back to a little later on. Now, here's a good time, should I say, to highlight connections between alien abductions and poltergeist phenomena, because there are many details that are shared. Now, many people who claim they have suffered alien abduction, particularly repeat abductees, they'll look back once they discover that they have been abducted. They'll look back at the weeks or months leading up to this revelation, and they'll suddenly realize more often than not that they were hearing like strange noises in the house. Items have gone missing, or items have been moved altogether. Perhaps a little bit more unsettling, they'll hear strange voices, conversations to the side of them, and they turn around, but there's nobody there. And perhaps most unsettling of all are encounters with shadow people. And these are exactly what they sound like, shadowy figures that people see out the corner of their eye. And when they turn to face them, they're just simply not there. Now, we see these in poltergeists and hauntings, but we see them a lot in alien abduction cases. And it makes us wonder how many people are experiencing what they believe to be hauntings or ghostly encounters. And really, they're kind of anything but. Now, this is a good time to highlight a case that I kind of worked on with a woman. It was only remotely online. And she was experiencing what she thought was ghostly phenomena, but I suspected was something quite more profound. Now, I kind of found her on an internet forum on social media, and it was a forum for paranormal enthusiasts and people to share their experiences. And she was saying that she would go into her wardrobe, for example, and she would find that clothes were missing, and she had no memory of wearing them. And she'd find them discarded in different rooms of the house. And as I say, she had no memory of putting them on, and she certainly had no memory of just discarding them, in these different rooms. And she lived out in the country, in the north of England. More worrying to her, though, she said she was having increasingly intense dreams. And these were very vivid. And as the weeks and the months were going on, they were becoming more and more often and more intense. What really made my ears prick up, I suppose, is she spoke about, as she was coming out of these dreams, she'd have really bizarre memories of a strange owl that was looking at her through the window. Now, anyone in UFO and alien circles will know that people who often report seeing owls, they could really be memories of what we would describe as a grey alien, essentially. So I got hold of her and spoke to her directly, and I asked her if there's anything else that she could recall that she missed. And she said no, she didn't think so, but she made a joke and said they should often look at the bottom of her feet and find that they were dirty, as if she'd been walking outside with no shoes on. Now, again, she put this down to an outdoor lifestyle. She lived in the country. But I kind of suspected, combined with everything else that she had mentioned, that rather than having a playful spirit in the house, it was quite possible that she could have been abducted by aliens. Now, at this stage, she kind of shut up shop. She didn't want to contemplate UFOs or aliens, much less alien abduction. She was happy to speak about ghosts and poltergeists, and happy to contemplate that could have been what she was experiencing. But she just would not contemplate the notion at all that alien abduction could be the case. But what I think this shows is that there could be many people that are experiencing either something that is completely dismissed or something that they believe is a playful ghost or a mischievous spirit. And really, it could be something much more profound. So regarding alien abduction, there are other details that can be found in other areas of the paranormal. For example, if we look at near-death and out-of-body experiences, there are other details that we find in alien abduction cases. Now, it's important here to note as well that there are kind of two kinds, typically, of alien abductions. There's the grey aliens, which are kind of much more aggressive. People tend to recall these as, scary, fearful, frightening, certainly not nice. And then there are encounters with humanoid-type aliens, and people refer to these as the Nordics or the tall blondes. And as Preston Dennett, the American UFO researcher, would say, these can really be described as contact episodes as opposed to abductions. People are kind of, they tend to enter a spacecraft of their own accord. They're guided on there. They do so on a ramp or through a door. But if we turn our attention back to the Greys, most of these abductions tend to start with somebody heading towards a bright tunnel of light. Now, in terms of alien abductions, as approaching or waiting spacecraft, the entrance of the spacecraft that's seemingly hovering above where the person, is being abducted from. If we look at near-death experiences, though, people that they start the same way. People report heading towards a bright tunnel of light in exactly the same way as apparent alien abductions begin. Now, what's particularly interesting is both sets, near-death experiences and people who believe they've been abducted by aliens, they have no recall whatsoever of passing through this tunnel of light. 1 minute they're heading towards it, and then suddenly the environment changes and they're in a different place altogether, usually a brightly lit room. Now, we might imagine, excuse me, just take that. We might imagine that because of these similarities, that the people who are having near-death experiences and the people that are having claiming to have had alien abduction are essentially in the same realm. And it's in this realm where we find interactions take place with strange entities. Now, these entities, they're often described as being thin-framed, sometimes wearing a hooded robe, which would be more akin to really medieval ghosts. But again, it shows up in alien abduction cases a lot, and usually with large black eyes, as you can see from this drawing here by Gerald Pratt, who experienced this being while astral projecting. Now, it's also interesting to look at some of the statues from ancient times and carvings of, apparent gods that are more often than not depicted with having particularly large eyes. So we might imagine that, the person who witnessed these entities, these creatures, this particular feature made quite an impression on them. Now, these people were most likely shamanistic priests who made contact with the gods, whether through intense concentration methods or hallucinogens to assist, or both. And essentially, we might suggest that these priest kings or shamans, however they did manage to put themselves into an alternative state, their consciousness managed to go to the same realm that out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and even alien abductees find themselves in today in the modern world, and interacted with the same entities. So we have to question, are grey aliens actually aliens, or are they just entities from another realm, another entity from another dimension? Now, here it's worth quickly looking at Aleister Crowley, and specifically some of the rituals that he performs trying to communicate with otherworldly entities. Now, some of these took place in a hotel in New York 30 years before the Roswell crash, and almost half a century before alien abduction, specifically with grey aliens, was part of the human psyche. Now, during one of these sessions, Crowley claimed that he made contact with a creature called Lamb. Now, as you can see here from this picture of Lamb, drawn by Crowley, it's remarkably similar to what we would understand to be a grey alien. Now, also of interest is two of Crowley's students, Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard, in the mid-1940s, just prior to the Roswell crash. They conducted their own experiments in an attempt to communicate with otherworldly entities. Now, we have to treat these claims with a certain amount of salt, a certain pinch of salt, but some researchers have suggested that the communications did indeed take place and did indeed happen, but that the portal or gateway, whatever was used, was not shut correctly. And they point to this being the start of the modern UFO era. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll leave that on the table, and that's perhaps a topic for another time. Now, here it's worth mentioning another trivial detail that shows up in an abundance of paranormal cases, whether it's ghosts, poltergeists, Bigfoot, UFOs, aliens. All of them have the same detail of the overpowering odor of sulfur. People who experience alien abduction state that where these encounters take place, you can smell sulfur. When a UFO has vacated a landing spot, for example, people say the same thing. The same with Bigfoot. If we go back to ancient times and legends of folklore concerning demons and devils, this noxious odor shows up there, and it's often associated with the underworld or hell. So it shouldn't surprise us that it does surface in many of the many paranormal encounters. So we might ask, what is this odor, and why does it show up in an abundance of paranormal cases? Well, if we're saying that some kind of portal is used or way is used that gives these entities, whatever they are, access to our world, could we be looking at some kind of disturbance of the sulfur compounds in the natural environment? Could it be that when the environment meshes back together, for example, that the result of that is this noxious smell, and that would explain and probably perhaps corroborate a little further, why sulfur is so prominent in paranormal cases. Now, one last thing to mention before I move on to some of my personal encounters is a thing called the psychic internet theory, and I think this is really quite important. Now, this was put forward by researcher and author Peter McHugh in his book Paranormal Encounters on Britain's Roads. And he himself said that he built on suggestions and theories of George Tyrrell, the psychical researcher from the early 20th century. Now, who offered essentially that hallucinations engendered by telepathy could explain a whole host of paranormal encounters. Now, McHugh took this further, and he offered that many paranormal events could be a result of extreme telepathy, almost like a kind of group telepathy. And a good example of this would be to look at UFO hotspots, and more specifically, how many people will sometimes descend on these hotspots with the hope of, seeing a UFO, essentially. So all these subconscious minds that are there hoping to see a UFO, wishing to see a UFO, all this subconscious energy, they're like, as McHugh said, they're like computers that are connected on the internet. And this subconscious energy could result in a physically real manifestation, which is essentially created by the subconscious mind. This idea of emotion and subconsciousness, it shows up in other areas of the paranormal.
Not like the last line about a friend holding space for you, comma, can you reword it, please?
Nothing like that. So basically what we're saying there is, if we look at poltergeist encounters, often we see that centered around a young child or a particular person, they'll say that the energy is feeding poltergeist or the entity. So perhaps McHugh is really onto something there, that, we're looking at entities or objects or beings that could be physically manifested. Now, it's worth, and if I just step back, it's worth mentioning the Egyptian creator god Ptah. Now, according to legend, Ptah brought the world into being. He created the universe through the thought of his heart and the utterance of his tongue. And what's why he did this, according to ancient writings, on a winged chair. So are these just legends, or should we take these at much more face value? Did Ptah, for example, use some kind of subconscious power combined with a technical device to literally manifest physical objects into existence? Or perhaps if we accept for one moment that Ptah was real and did exist at some point in time, he understood how to use the power of his mind to interact with the universe itself and manifest a collective reality. Now, briefly, it's worth mentioning such organizations as the Knights Templar and other secret societies, specifically because their rituals and their knowledge and their wisdom stretches right the way back to the ancient mystery schools of ancient Egypt. And although it's not as simple as to say that the Knights Templar became the Freemasons, their descendants showed up hundreds of years after they were abolished in many Masonic lodges around Europe and then in the New World of America. So you might imagine that those rituals, those Masonic rituals and wisdoms and knowledge were very much the same as those of the Templars and in turn mystery schools in ancient Egypt. We might also ask if there's some kind of paranormal connection to these rituals. If we're saying that there's people have a command or can have a command over consciousness, and that consciousness can manifest all manner of apparitions and entities, then were the Templar Knights and are Freemasons still today privy to this knowledge? Now, again, we'd have to take this with a pinch of salt, and this is wildly speculative. But if you look at the Angels and Mons, where essentially, a group of bowmen protected British troops in the First World War, ghostly bowmen at that, some research has suggested that this event had connections to the wisdom and knowledge of the Templar Knights and in turn Freemasons. Now, again, that sounds really quite preposterous, but when we look at, say, the intelligence agencies, whether it be the CIA, the NSA, or military intelligence, they've got a real interest in ancient relics, ancient devices, have spent considerable time and money searching for the Black Third Reich. They spent considerable time and money and effort searching for multiple ancient relics in the run-up to and during the Second World War. So we might ask, well, why were they searching for this stuff? Is it just a prestige? Is it for financial gain? Or did they know something through secret societies, through their own research? Did they know something that the rest of us didn't? Did they know that these ancient societies could somehow tap into human consciousness and expand human consciousness? Now, it's briefly worth mentioning here that there have been many experiments, both official and unofficial, that have looked to stir up paranormal activity out of nowhere, even looked to manifest poltergeists out of nowhere. And these have worked to varying degrees. There are even claims of experiments with the intelligence agencies of a person manifesting a physical object out of thin air, such as a cup or the ball or something like that. And we also know that in poltergeist cases, objects disappear into thin air and they seemingly appear out of thin air. So it doesn't really, it's not as that much of a stretch of the imagination as we might think. Now, earlier, we looked at paranormal encounters being able to tap into human emotions and ultimately human consciousness. And when people experience paranormal events, they often find that they have bizarre abilities that they simply didn't have before. And these range from like clairvoyance, telepathy, telekinesis, and even an ability to interact with electricity. Now, this last one is particularly interesting, given that entities of the paranormal, according to many researchers, appear to be very much connected to electromagnetic energies. Now, it's worth mentioning briefly here a group of people called sliders. Now, these are people that can seemingly affect lighting, predominantly street lighting, but essentially any type of electrical device from afar. Street lamp interference phenomenon, it's called, and it's been researched sporadically for decades. But one person who researched it extensively is Hilary Evans. And before his death in 2011, he stated in no uncertain terms that it was his belief that these people were being very honest and very truthful, and they had a certain gift or ability to directly affect electrical devices and directly affect electricity. What is also of interest here is that many of these people stated, certainly before they could control this, is that these events often happened where they're under undue stress or severe emotional distress. So once again, we've got a connection between paranormal abilities, paranormal phenomena, and human emotions and human stress and things of that nature. Now, we might wonder if people can affect devices, if they can affect things outside of themselves, then that could be a two-way street. And it's worth mentioning before I say this next part that, modern science is right now, even today, looking at the possibility that consciousness doesn't come from within, but it comes from an external source. It could the outside source basically bypass known human stimuli, such as, hearing, sight, smell, touch, and create consciousness inside the mind. Essentially, it would be influencing a person without them actually seeing, without them actually being aware of it subconsciously. Now, there are also connections, if we stay on the notion of human emotions, that these otherworldly entities are not just influencing people and influencing human emotions, but they're actually feeding off them. Now, this comes up a lot in encounters with reptilians, which is a tricky subject, but it also comes up with encounters of cryptids, and it's probably best displayed with encounters of cryptids. Now, encounters with Bigfoot, for example, they're often from afar and they're very rarely violent. But encounters with cryptid creatures such as dogmen, for example, tend to be anything but. People who find themselves, unfortunately enough, find themselves coming face to face with such a creature, often find themselves being pursued by it. And invariably they'll find themselves, trapped or cornered, or they'll trip. And this creature then is poised, waiting for the kill. But unlike any other predator in nature, which would basically finish the job and go in for the kill at this point, these creatures tend to stay where they are for a moment and then simply just vanish, just turn around and disappear. So we have to question there, rather than being interested in physically attacking a person, are these creatures more interested in feeding off human emotions, particularly negative emotions such as fear and fright and distress? Now, I know that sounds like a plot from Monsters, Inc., the movie, but that really is what appears to be happening. And as I say, it isn't just with cryptids. We look at poltergeist cases where, people, the more scared you become, the more frightened you become, the more intense the goings-on appear to be. So, at this stage, I would like to speak to you a little bit more about some of the strange encounters I've personally experienced. And while I won't go into this in great detail, because I'll do that in the book, and obviously, we've only got a certain amount of time, I will mention how I believe that the encounters I've experienced fit into the wider anomalous world. Now, many of these things happened years ago, unfortunately. And as such, I wasn't keeping records basically at that point. We're talking when I was a young child. And I simply at the time didn't really realize that, anything too strange was actually happening. And I certainly didn't contemplate that I would be writing about it or speaking about it or doing research into it. So, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of, it was approximately then, and it was approximately this long after that. So, for that, I apologize. But, unfortunately, it is what it is. Now, when I was 6 or 7, I had a significant blow to the head, 2 blows to the head in short succession. Now, the first was when I was at school in a playground. We were playing a game that would certainly be banned today in the modern world, and we had like an older lad would lie on his back, he'd put his feet up, and you'd sit on his feet, and he would launch you into the air. So you had like the sensation of flying, and 9 times out of 10, you'd land on your feet, do a little forward roll, and absolutely brilliant. This day when I did it, though, I remember seeing the sky rushing towards me, and the next thing I knew, I was laid out on the playground, on the stone playground, which I'd hit face first. I must have been unconscious for 5 or 6 seconds or so. The next thing I knew, there was dim ladies all around me. And I did get taken to the doctors, and he checked me over. And, apart from a huge bump on my head, he said, he seems all right. If he sees any flashing lights, then, take him to A&E, but everything was fine. Several months after this, I received the second bang on the head, and this was when I was at my auntie's house. Again, about 3, 4, maybe 6 months later. And I was playing in a sleeping bag. I was only about 6 or 7, and I had it up to my neck. My arms were by my side, so I had no way of steadying myself, and I was just kind of jumping about, buggering about, basically, as a kid would do. And as I was jumping around like in a bizarre sack craze, the sleeping bag caught on a nail that was on the runner in between a carpeted hallway and the stone kitchen floor. Now, obviously, when that happened, I went to jump, the sleeping bag didn't move, and I smacked my head right on the kitchen floor. And it was such a bump that I remember my uncle, I remember him saying that it looked like I had a hard-boiled egg on the front of my head, and that's exactly what it did look like. Now, again, I was checked out, there was no problems. But after that, I started having a few strange encounters. Now, those bangs on the head could be absolutely coincidence. But when we just circle back to the sliders that we spoke about, many of them said that their ability, to affect electrical devices came after traumatic experiences, often blows to the head and things of that nature. And on a particular day, I was returning back from my auntie's with my mother. It was in the winter, and it was snowing. We'd had a real bad snowstorm. And as we were coming back home, it was about 4 o'clock. It was just starting to get dark. It was snowing again, but not much. And some of the kids were playing on our street. So I met Mum, can I go play? And she said, yeah, I'll be back by a certain time, probably 7 o'clock. And off I went. And while we were playing, it's like snowing heavier and heavier. And at one point, I remember just looking up at the snowflakes, just watching them fall, real big snowflakes. And it was really quite blizzardy. And the next thing I knew, I was on my own. Everyone else had gone in. I was just stood there outside. And to begin with, I thought that they were playing some kind of joke. I thought they were going to come out from behind a wall or from behind the garages. But there was nobody there. I was literally by myself. And I went home, and when I got home, I discovered I was about 10 to 15 minutes late. Now, we didn't have a phone, so my mum was just about to come out and start looking for me. But I had no idea what happened to that hour, whether I was just stood there. I have no idea why my friends just essentially left. Now, I didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, but I had another similar account 6, 7 months later, and I was at my auntie's house once more. Now, on this occasion, my auntie, she'd gone away to the coast. She'd asked my mother to look after the property for her. In reality, she lived in a much nicer house than we did. And it was a chance for us to, spend a couple of days with lots of modern gadgets, VHS video, for example, which we didn't have. And so, and in terms of when this happened, I remember renting the movie Teen Wolf on VHS because we only had a Betamax. It wasn't available on that. So I remember getting that. So we're probably talking about 86, 87, possibly. Now, the room I was staying in at my auntie's house, it overlooked like a patch of land that was behind the housing estate and behind the main road. And the council had put a swing there, and there's a climbing frame. But there was also kind of unofficial businesses, really, like a stockyard. I remember the place full of tears, and there was a guy who used to sell tomato seeds and plant seeds and things like that. Now, I was looking out my window one night, and it wasn't that late, before midnight, I would imagine, because my mother was still awake. I could hear her in the room next to mine. And I saw something moving around in one of these stockyards. Just a guy, really. He had a hood up, he had a hood on, like a jacket. And I didn't know what he was doing, but I was watching him for about a minute. And all of a sudden, I had this overwhelming feeling that he was going to turn around and look dead at me. So I just ducked below the window, and I stayed there probably for only a minute or two, but it felt like half an hour. And I daren't look out the window thinking he's going to be right there. Eventually did. There was nobody there. And again, I kind of put it to the back of my mind. But the next morning, you know, I went outside. I was up before everybody else. Must have been about 7 o'clock, getting daylight. And I initially just went out to play in the garden. But then I kind of remembered what I'd seen. So I ventured out into this like little park area and where I'd seen this guy. And intrigued and curious, I started walking up to where I'd seen him. The next thing I knew, I was walking back into my auntie's garden. My mum stood in the house doorway, you know, really quite annoyed, saying, "Where have you been? I've been shouting you." And, you know, I remember looking at a clock when I got in the house, and it was about 9:30 time. So, again, I've got about an hour and a half, 2 hours there, which I've no idea what happened, and I can't recall walking out of that wasteland, and I can't recall anything until I was actually in my auntie's garden. So, whether these strange trances are anything, or whether they're connected to the bang on the head I had or not, I really don't know. But it's something that I didn't really look to until when I was researching things as an adult. Now, these encounters happened when I had just moved into a house. This is the house right here. And this is taken in modern times. I mean, when I was living there, it didn't look as nice as that, put it that way. And when I lived there for about 5 years. And again, it's not something that I realized at the time, but looking back on it, I spent all my time in that house absolutely terrified, particularly when I was in my bedroom, which is this front bedroom here, which you can see just above the satellite dish. Particularly, I was just terrified of the dark, to the point where I would sleep with my light on. I'd have a torch by the bed. I would check the batteries religiously. I'd have to ensure that the door handle was up and wedged up so I could tell if someone was trying to push it down. I mean, I was really, really terrified. I've never felt anything like that before, and I've never felt anything like it afterwards. And again, it's not something I realized at the time, even when going through it. When I moved from that property, I just suddenly realized I wasn't scared anymore. So I don't know whether, again, that's connected to my head, whether that's connected to something that I experienced. It is worth pointing out, with us speaking about electrical magnetic energy and electrical energy, as you can see from this picture here, the house was barely 200, 300 yards away from pylons and electrical cables, which ran right along the back of those fields. And interestingly or not, and this has just occurred to me now, those pylons ran right the way to my auntie's house, which was about a mile away. So that electronic influence, if you like, was there at that property as well. Now, once I moved out of this house from about 12 years old, I didn't really experience anything until I was in my late teens. And again, I suspect that this was prompted by a knock to the head. Now, at this point, I was working at a second-hand car garage. It's about 16, 17, and my main job was basically just to valet cars, wash the cars, excuse me. But occasionally, when we had a car that had to be valeted, I was asked to help with this. And so on this particular day, I was in the back garage, and there was actual mechanics there, and they were working on this car. And I know nothing about cars, and I still don't. But I think they were doing something with the tire pressure, and the guy switched it off, and he just said, "Oh, will you unplug that for us?" And I went to take it off, which looked like a tap essentially, and the guy suddenly just said, "No." And I stopped what I was doing. I moved my hand away, and I must have moved this device a bit, and it suddenly shot off. If my hand had been on it, it probably would have been taken off. But as I moved back, I banged my head on the car boot, which was open because we were obviously valeting it. And although I didn't knock myself unconscious, I did see white for a few seconds. Now, I didn't make anything of it. I didn't make a fuss. I just kind of went back to work. But it was a bit of a crack. Several weeks later, though, I was upstairs in the main building. Now, the car lot was essentially an old house. Downstairs was all nice, and that's where the customers went, and that's where there was like a drinks machine and things like that. Upstairs was like something out of the Chernobyl diaries. I mean, it was just completely empty. The walls were practically crumbling. There was rust all over the toilet that was there. And one day I was sent up there to get some of the powdered drinks for the drinks machine, soups, coffees, hot chocolate, that kind of thing in plastic cups. And I was getting them, and all of a sudden, I had this intense feeling that I was being watched. That not just that I felt a bit spooked, that something was watching me. And I basically couldn't get out of there fast enough. I ran down the stairs, and to the point where I didn't even look behind me because I felt that something was going to be there. Now, again, I was 16, 17. I put that out of the back of my mind. And a few months later, I had an experience in the same part of the building. Now, on this occasion, I was on my own in the building. The guy, the main boss, he'd gone to a meeting somewhere. And he often did this. He'd leave me there for a couple of hours and basically, any customers come in, show them round, get the details, that kind of thing. It was a Sunday. There was no one on the car lot. It was completely dead, basically. And I knew there was a drum kit upstairs. So I was in a band at the time, and I don't play drums, but I play guitar. But I thought, I'm going to go up there. I'm going to have a bit of a bash around on those drums. I could see the forecourt, so I could see if anyone came in. And, I must have been playing 2 or 3 minutes, blasting out my best Metallica drums and things like that. And then I happened just to glance to my side to the doorway, and there was a figure stood there. And I immediately stopped playing. And initially, I thought, he's back, the boss is back, I'm going to get hammered. What am I doing up here? And then when I looked back again, there was nobody there, nobody. And at this point, I froze. And that same feeling of terror that I had in the house that we were speaking about previously, it kind of washed over me. And I froze literally for 5 or 6 seconds, thinking, do I just stay here and sit it out, or do I run? And eventually I ran, and I just pelted it out of there. And I never went back up there after that. I think maybe once when I went with somebody else, but I didn't go there by myself, and I certainly didn't go there to mess about with drums. But that, again, after that, things died down. I didn't really experience anything strange for years. Now we have to fast forward to 2008, and this is where things really changed for me. And this is what really kind of dragged me into truly looking to research the paranormal in a serious way. In 2008, we just moved into this property that I'm living in right now. I was married. We had, I still do have a son, but he was 6 years old at the time. And my wife was pregnant with what would have been our second child. Unfortunately, in November 2008, my wife suffered an ectopic pregnancy. Now, as you can imagine, that's, awful enough. But she was rushed into emergency theatre, emergency operations. I don't think I actually realised at the time how precarious the situation was while she was actually in surgery. The years that followed, as you might imagine, were full of intense grief, anger, frustration, not just at the fact that we'd suffered this ectopic pregnancy, but our chances of having a second child had been severely reduced. And indeed, we didn't manage to do that despite numerous procedures, numerous visits to the hospital. During this time, as I say, we both were kind of very angry at the world, very angry at the universe, I suppose you would say. But during this time, I started venturing down into paranormal research. I had a particular interest in astral projection. Now, perhaps naively and irresponsibly, I did a little bit of learning on the internet of how to astral project, now to possibly try and leave my own body. And I think I did this partly out of interest and partly because of a way of just escaping the negativity that was surrounding our lives at the time. And indeed, I did manage to learn how to astral project, very basically. One evening while I was sat in this room, I was in the chair that's right behind me there, and my wife and son were in the living room across the hallway, and I was, going through concentration techniques and not putting myself into a trance, but putting myself into a state, into a mental state. And all of a sudden, I found myself in the living room, almost laid out flat, but not on the floor, just above. And I could see my son, I could see my wife, I could see what they were watching on television. And I was probably there for about 7 or 8, 10 seconds maybe. And all of a sudden I felt a bit of a pull, and then I woke up in my chair. Now, this unnerved me a little bit. I'd had kind of visions of things before, but I wasn't sure if that was just my mind. But this was something very real. What followed after that was really bizarre dreams. Really intense dreams, where I'd find myself floating just above the ground, but going along our street, and I was almost swimming through the air and moving really quickly. And I spoke to a researcher, Gerald Pratt, about this not so long ago, and he was saying, that could have actually been lucid dreams. Only today I was reading, though, about how quantum physicists are examining the possibility that dreams are actually trips into other dimensions. And I often wonder if I kind of latched onto another version of myself in these dreams. But that's by the by. The culminating thing that really made me really want to get to the bottom of this is one night I woke up, and to this day I don't know whether this is a dream or whether this was real. I was laid on my bedroom floor. I wasn't in my bed, and there was a strange creature at the doorway, and it had a hold of my foot, which was up at an angle like this. And it was almost trying to drag me. I was trying to scream out and I couldn't do it. And, I was looking at the creature's face and I could see no details. Even though I was looking dead at it, it had a face. I just could not see any details of it. It lasted about a minute, and then I woke up, and it's the most scared I've ever been. And I don't know whether that was just an intense dream, sleep paralysis. I accept that that's a possibility, but it was so real and it was so intense. When I've done research on astral projection, people speak about entities being all around them, and sometimes these entities will race back to your body or try to before you can. Now, I'm not saying that's happening here, but I do find it interesting that after I managed to astral project, I have these intense dreams, and particularly this one dream of a bizarre entity. Now, I mentioned earlier that when I was in the house we spoke about, as a child, I would have absolute feelings of terror. Now, these feelings started happening again. I would sometimes fall asleep, like we all do, in the armchair, on the settee downstairs, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and, normally you just go to bed, but I'd wake up, probably happened about half a dozen times over the course of several years, with just absolute feelings of terror running through me. And again, feeling like I felt in the old garage, do I just lay here and freeze and don't move? Or do I belt it upstairs and not look back? And invariably, that's what I would do. I would just run out of the room. But I couldn't explain those feelings of absolute terror, basically. Most prominent, though, of these experiences is, as I was researching things and I was getting more and more into writing, I was freelancing, so I was becoming more and more familiar with paranormal activity and paranormal phenomena. I kept seeing what I can only describe as a little boy in the house. Now, to get to this office where I'm sat now, you have to go from our living room across the hall, and the stairs are on your left if you're coming in, or on the right if you're coming out. And several times I would walk from the living room to the office, or the other way around, and I would see a boy standing at the top of the stairs. I'd turn around and he was just not there. He'd gone. And this happened several times over the course of about a year or so. It was always at the back of the property as well. I saw him once downstairs. We have glass doors leading out into our back garden at the back of the house. And one day I was in the living room and he was standing there. And then when I focused in that area, he'd gone. So I started researching, thinking, well, did something happen in the house? Did a child unfortunately pass away, maybe at the back of the property? But there was nothing. The people who had it before us, they just moved out as a family normally would do. And this house was built in the 60s, so it's not got like a long history. So I started to contemplate just like who this child was. Was it a spirit? I even contemplated at one point, was it the spirit of the child that we might have had if my wife hadn't had an ectopic pregnancy? Now, these sightings continued, and they're only bare sightings, but then as my knowledge of the paranormal phenomena increased, and seemingly as I became more open to such things, these sightings became longer and more intense. I was writing in the living room, and I have a computer in the living room as well. I was writing there one day, and I turned around, and the boy was standing there, and instead of disappearing, he just stayed there, and he waved and just disappeared. And I've never seen anything like that. And that unnerved me to the point where I had to ring my wife, because she never saw this boy. She never experienced him. And I said, I've just seen him again. And this just carried on and on. And it culminated with, and it coincided with a time when things kind of eased for us, whether that was because we'd kind of moved on as much as we could do. But I was sitting in that chair behind me again, like before, and I was dozing again. And the next thing, I realized the boy was standing right beside me, and his hand was moving across my head. Now, he wasn't touching my head. If you touched my head, I could feel your hand there. I couldn't feel him physically touch me, but I could feel his hand just moving across my head. And he said, or I heard the words, "It'll be okay. It's all going to be okay now." And then he disappeared. And after that, things settled down. Now, what I think that was, and I'm going to move on to something else in a minute briefly, is that I believe those emotions that I was feeling, we were both feeling, the negative emotions, the anger, the frustration, I think that they tapped into something otherworldly. And whether that opened a portal or a door, whether it opened a door in my own mind. And of course, I've got to be realistic. And, this could have been a mental reaction to a particularly, traumatic experience. But again, going just off feelings, I don't think that's the case. And I've questioned whether that is the case many, many times. So I suppose what you need to think is, was this some kind of guardian angel, some kind of spirit guide, or was it a trickster entity? Was it trying to force me onto a path, paranormal research, writing about paranormal? I don't know, but things did settle down for a while. However, in January 2025, things started again, and they started in abundance. And this time, I wasn't the only person who noticed this or experienced this. And once more, they started through heavy emotion. In January 2025, we lost our beautiful dog, Walter, basically. Now, I know people say, oh, it's just a dog, but if you've owned a dog, you know that they're anything but. And if I'm honest, I think it was the first time that I'd actually experienced real, solid grief. I literally didn't eat for a week. It took me a couple of weeks after that to kind of get myself back to normality again. And yeah, we were just both, it felt like the world had stopped, essentially. Now, around the same time, we started experiencing very bizarre phenomena in the house. My wife started experiencing it as well. And again, I think this is kick-started by intense emotion, negative emotion. It doesn't have to be negative, just intense emotion. A good example is my wife, she has pine cones on the front door, on the doorstep, several of them. And we started finding one particular pine cone being moved, and it wasn't just blown about by the wind. We'd find it on top of the bin, we'd find it on the post at the end of the garden, we found it on the bonnet of the car, and we did several things. You know, we'd move this pine cone, we'd put it at the back of a tree we have there so it couldn't just be blown about. And not every day, but probably once a month, we would find it in different places, this particular pine cone. In fact, it's sitting right there in my office now. We eventually brought it in. After we did that, there was no more disturbances with any of the other pine cones. But then one morning I opened the door and I found two bright brass coins, foreign coins, just waiting for me on the doorstep. Now, my colleague and co-host of the Anomaly Project, Steve Mero, will tell you that when these things happen, the phenomena will leave things where you can find them and where you will not miss them. And this was very much the case. I opened the door and they were right there and I couldn't miss them at all. My wife, though, had also started to notice other phenomena in the house. We'd hear footsteps, and to begin with, I would dismiss her and say, oh, it's next door, or it's someone walking by the house, and it sounds like there's footsteps. But one evening when we were laid in bed, and my wife was asleep, and I woke up, and I could hear something downstairs, and I could hear footsteps on the stairs. And in my mind, I thought, basically, we're being burgled, someone's in the house, and I'm bracing myself for somebody to come through the bedroom. And we got to the top of the stairs, and they just stopped. And I could just tell that there wasn't anybody there standing still. They had just stopped and disappeared. Now, 2 or 3 minutes I laid there and eventually plucked up the courage to go and have a look. There was nobody on the landing, nobody downstairs, no disturbances. But we definitely heard those footsteps. And my wife woke up towards the tail end of that. We also started to notice strange burning smells in the house, like plastic, burnt plastic. And, numerous times over the last few months, we've been looking, there was something's ablaze, something's on fire, but there never has been. And as I say, these things are happening more and more regularly. Only the other day, we were sat in the living room, and above us is our son's bedroom, and he lives in London at the moment, and there's nobody in the house apart from us. And we could hear a bang in the bedroom and footsteps, and we went upstairs, there's nobody there. One of the last things that happened to us, we were fast asleep one night. About 3 o'clock in the morning, we both woke up to a massive, massive beeping sound, like a smoke alarm, but just so loud, it woke us both up straight away. And we were looking at each other, can you hear that? What's that? And it wasn't a smoke alarm, it wasn't any electrical device. And I got up eventually after it'd been going on for 30 seconds and tried to find where it was coming from. And what was strange is no matter where we went in the house, it didn't get any quieter or louder. It just stayed the same, like it was just all around us. A beeping I've never actually heard before. And at the same time, by the time I come back to bed when it had stopped, we could both smell that kind of rotting smell, a bit like sulfur, but it was more like burning plastic. And it made us wonder whether something had happened, and that reaction, that smell was, again, a sign of some kind of paranormal phenomena. When I researched this online, and, I'm talking getting to like age 17 or 18 of Google, into these bizarre forums where people are really talking some interesting stuff, a few people said that these beeps can be a sign of either alien abduction or a paranormal event. Now, I certainly don't think I was abducted by aliens by any stretch, but it does make me wonder if something did happen that night, and if that was, that was an indication of it. And I think all this has started because of, as I say, the emotion, but also because I think we're more receptive to it. I've also always been receptive to this and open to it, but I think my wife is now. And I think that combination of our consciousness, our subconsciousness, and what we're willing to perceive and what we're willing to accept, I think it kind of opened a doorway to the phenomena. But that's why I'm in my research. And, as I say, it's in flux, and how this will fit into the wider world of the paranormal, only further research will tell. Now, I know we're kind of rushed for time here. So I really want to just kind of go through a few other aspects of the paranormal and how they might fit in to what we've been speaking about here. Because, as I say, I think the connections are wide and ranging, and they stretch into all aspects of our lives. I mean, if we take reincarnation, for example, is reincarnation, or our concept of it, really like a past life memory? Or if we're saying that people can astral project and consciousness is so important and essentially alive even after death, then could it be if we astral project into these astral realms, whether on purpose or by mistake in dreams, could we be actually accessing past life memories of the consciousness of people who might have lived decades or even centuries before us? And I mentioned dreams. I mean, most science will tell you that dreams is your brain kind of sorting out your memories and sorting out, what you've done that day and so on and so forth. But again, could dreams be trips to other dimensions? I mean, I have repeated dreams of walking around my housing estate. We have like a school at the bottom, a chemist, there's a pub down the road and a bus stop. And I'm walking around these in my dreams sometimes, but they're slightly different in a way that you can't quite put your finger on. And the researcher said to me months ago, maybe dreams are you latching on to, all of us, not just me, latching on to another version of yourself in another dimension. And although, it was just a suggestion, it was something that he found interesting. And I really kind of resonated with that, because I thought, well, yeah, they really could be. What about spontaneous human combustion, for example? There's another area. And it's particularly when we work in the smell of sulfur and burning plastic. Now, could these tragic events be the result of electromagnetic energy? Like some kind of energy conversions, perhaps like an overload of sorts, where a person might have been at a singularity type point and unfortunately suffered the consequences. We also might know that people who have close proximity to UFO encounters or encounters with aliens often find straight burn marks on their bodies and other kind of intrusions there. And if you look at ancient accounts, stigmata and things of that nature, I think it was Diana Walsh-Pasalka who said that these could have been brought about by interactions with otherworldly entities. Now, I know all of this is wildly speculative at best, but I believe that these are the kind of questions that we need to be asking. These are the kind of things we need to be contemplating. And hopefully myself, along with other researchers, can carry out collective research, analyze data, and essentially get closer to some of the answers that all of us seek. Now, whether it's proof theories or proof theories, that doesn't really matter, because I think I'm correct in saying all of us just want the truth, regardless of who's right, regardless of who's wrong. We just want to know what's going on, because I think knowing the paranormal and understanding the paranormal will essentially help us understand our collective reality, our place in the universe, and essentially, for as cliche as it might sound, why we're here, the meaning of life. And I do think that paranormal research is so important to our collective reality. So I hope you've enjoyed this chat as much as I've enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you very much. And thank you. I've enjoyed speaking.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a whirlwind of lots of different topics that do intertwine and cross over with each other. The comment that I just put into the chat box here, I do wonder, I'm aware that in the Betty and Barney Hill case, it's probably the first time I remember the beeps being mentioned prior to an abduction phenomena occurring. But I kind of wonder, has there been an increase in the beeps being reported in abduction cases since, like, the motion tracker in the Alien movies? That rhythmic beep, beep, beep as the alien got closer. Now, I wonder if there's a correlation or an increase in reports post-1979 of beeps happening in abduction cases, or suddenly following like a big notable kind of public event, like a big movie, for instance. Considering how, like, after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, lots of people started reporting the tropes that first appeared in that movie publicly. And I assume that might happen again with this new movie of Steven Spielberg that he's got coming out. Will there be tropes that then get dropped into that movie that then become recurring tropes in the abduction phenomena post that? Have you thought about that?
I've not thought about the beeps, actually. It's an interesting thought because, you know, as you say, you know, society is undoubtedly influenced by media. You know, it's hard not to be. But in turn, you know, you look at media, it's almost influenced by society as well. I mean, people mention Spielberg, and I've got a friend, and he will say, oh, you know, he knows more than he's letting on. He puts hidden messages in his films. And believe me, I'm a big fan of this, you know, in terms of I find it very interesting that there's hidden messages in films. But it also could simply be, I mean, Spielberg is a professional, so he'll carry out the utmost research. He'll have people researching for him, so he'll be studying all the same stuff we're studying, you know, to put it in fiction. But just going back to the Betty and Barney Hill thing, what I find particularly interesting about that case is that they spoke about leaving a packed bag by the door, is, you know, in case they had to just flee. They didn't know why they might have to flee. They just had this feeling within them that they had to vacate the property real quick. And that kind of reminds me of that absolute terror that kind of I've experienced at times, but other people have said, you know, when they're in the middle of these things, they just have these feelings that they don't know where they're coming from. So when you mention Betty and Barney Hill, that's kind of what I think of there, is the fact that that encounter, whatever did take place on that lonely road, obviously affected their consciousness and their emotion and their outlook on life, which is understandably so. I mean, if it was just, and I say just, an alien abduction, that would be enough to do that anyway. But if we're talking about something else that's affecting your consciousness, then, yeah, I can imagine that being quite unsettling, to be fair.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, having a bug-out bag, as it were, just in case stuff goes wrong. I'm obviously aware that there was the racial components of their relationship that was frowned upon at that time. Yeah. I'm aware they might have had a fear of what that repercussions could be based on where they were staying. I mean, of course, it's not an issue these days, but back in those days, there certainly was in that particular area. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm aware that there's a lot of questions here, and I would like to certainly get to most of them, if possible. My kind of thoughts are I wanted to kind of... I'm aware that there's a lot of people here who are very sceptical of this position, and it's what I share myself. I go back and forth on many of these topics that you're talking about, and I'm very much entrenched with many of the topics that you're talking about. But I kind of try to hold the position of disbelief. If these things are happening, I can have a conversation about it. But say, obviously, you've done a lot of research with this. So do you think there's one case that you would point to that is a clear evidence of UAP, abductions, and poltergeist, where they are not separate phenomena, even the fairy abduction stuff? You know, is there one case you'd pick out and say this is an example of what it is and why it's important and it is happening for sure?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is. I want to say one particular case, but what I would say is okay, I'll tell you what, we'll go with it. There's a case, I think it was Tony Dodd that researched it, investigated it, should I say. And it happened in 95, I believe, in Derby. And it featured 4 people, and they were basically, as quickly as I can, they decided to have a last-minute barbecue. It was late at night, about 9 o'clock, them and their neighbours. And, you know, they lit the barbecue, a few beers, and then they noticed like a strange light up ahead. And, you know, this light was coming closer, and the next thing they knew, the food was burnt, the barbecue had gone out, and, you know, they had basically missing time. They eventually were regressed through Dodd and his team, and they, you know, there's lots of components that we've just been speaking about. They recalled strange biblical-like rooms with stone furniture that you wouldn't necessarily associate with spaceships. They recalled people with hooded robes, for example, which again you would expect to see in some kind of like a ghost in a medieval castle or something. They recalled being abducted by what we would term as grey aliens. And you know, after I wrote about this and put my own little thoughts on it, one of the team who investigated the case got hold of me. And they said that this wasn't reported, but, and this guy's unfortunately passed away since, that this wasn't reported, but all 4 of them started having strange abilities after that encounter, whether it be being able to see, into the future, strange abilities, being able to move objects and stuff of that nature. So, I would imagine that would, and I don't know this, but I would imagine that would include paranormal poltergeist type abilities as well, or encounters as well. The only thing that case is missing, and I'm not aware, maybe it did have it, but it is cryptid encounters. People sometimes have encounters with strange creatures. I don't think that was the case there, but that case isn't a unique or exclusive case. I think there's so many cases where, like you say, people who don't realize they've been abducted start to think that they're being haunted. And it's only after the fact that they realize, oh, okay, well, that's what that is. I mean, shadow people with alien abductions, for example, and what is that? I mean, so is it a poltergeist or a ghost or whatever, and it's using the same mechanism? Some researchers have said that no, it's not that at all. It's actually some kind of cloaking technology, and these beings, whatever they are moving around quite freely. But if something's made invisible, it doesn't just disappear, you see through it. You'll be left with this kind of, according to some researchers, left with this kind of shadowy essence. So I think just answering your question is a good example of how huge the subject actually is, and how it takes more than one researcher, even more than a team of researchers. There's so much data to analyze. There's so many cases to go through. I mean, how many reports don't even get reported because people don't want to be ridiculed, or they don't want to admit to themselves that they're involved in something strange. So, yeah, I mean, that's the case that I would go to, but I think there's so many more. And probably, we have half-hour thinking time. I could probably find a couple which did have absolutely everything in them as well.
Well, you mentioned there about the almost side effects of contact. So those who have, strange anomalous experiences, particularly with the abduction phenomena, they then have these almost unintended side effects. Healing is quite a common trope. Yeah. The ability to easily project themselves, the motion that they can sense people around them, but also the poltergeist phenomenon then appears to be it locks in on them a bit. They appear then to have those kind of things happening around them. I'm aware of cases that have those notes to that. So I'm going to throw back over to Crowley, so I'm aware that there's a lot of questions here.